All right, here we are. We're on day 4 of ecosystems. And when we started, we said that by the end of this, we're going to be able to say that I can identify the different factors of an ecosystem in order to understand why and how they interact. And so we started off pretty slowly with that, and we really just identified the two types, the really broad factors in an ecosystem. We said that there were biotic and abiotic factors. And we know that biotic factors are living things. Those are your animals. Those are your plants in the ecosystem. And we understand that they have very specific roles. We call that a niche or a niche. We'll have that vocabulary word very soon. Very important word. And they all have very specific roles, which is what a niche is. They have a role in the ecosystem, something that they do very specifically that's important. We also know that in an ecosystem, especially when we start talking about very specific biomes, there are abiotic factors that make each biome unique. From your sunlight to your soil type to your temperature to how much water, rainfall and water that you can find in the area. And those things are very important. And obviously animals interact with abiotic factors. Abiotic factors influence the way that animals behave. In maybe a rainforest, you're not going to need a giant thick coat of fur to keep warm because it's super warm there. You're going to need to be adapted to having lots of water. However, if you live in the Arctic where it's very cold, you're going to need to be able to adapt to the cold because it's very cold. The sunlight's very limited there. You don't get a lot of rain, and you probably are going to need a coat of fur that's not only thick to keep you warm, but white because it snows there a lot. And if you're like a giant brown rabbit running around the white snow, well, the polar bear can find you pretty quickly and eat you. So we know that that happens. But then we started breaking it down, and we started talking about something in particular called producers. And producers are plants. Now, we know that it's very important in an ecosystem to have plants. And again, this is another factor in an ecosystem. And we know that if we look at this ecosystem here, I see the plants in the background. And I know that plants are very specific, and we don't just call them plants. We learned a new word. We call them producers. Now, it was a very specific reason why these things are called producers. And it's because they make their own food. It's very important to understand that they make their own food. And they do that by using sunlight. So they're able to, because of the cells in their bodies, take sunlight and turn it into energy, which is important because that's the beginning of the food chain. If producers didn't make their food, then the herbivores couldn't eat the plants and get energy, and then something can eat the herbivore and get energy from that. Our food chain would be broken down automatically. It's important to understand that producers produce. They make their own food. And they do that through a process called photosynthesis. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. We also learned that there are consumers. These are the things that do not make their own food. They consume they consume food. They eat. And so I might be one of the different types of consumers. And we learned that there are 3 main types of consumers, one being an herbivore. Now we know that herbivores, they only eat plants. They only eat producers. And that's very important. They are what we're going to call the first level consumer when we get to our food chains and our food pyramids. They are the first thing that eats because technically producers don't eat. They make their own food. The first thing to eat, the first level consumer, is called an herbivore. And it's important to understand them because they only eat plants. They get that first energy. The sun gives energy to the plants give energy to the herbivores. Now, you might have this little rabbit here, but along comes a fox. And a fox is a carnivore. They only eat meat. Depending on where we fall in the food chain, you're going to have some second-level consumers and some tertiary consumers, and we'll get into that later. That depends on when you're eating down the food chain. But understanding that carnivores only eat meat. That is very important to understand. Your carnivores only eat meat. That takes us to those animals like primates and bears, most humans, that eat meat and plants, and we are called omnivores. And it's important to understand that omnivores eat both plants producers and they eat meat. Because if we don't think about that, it might get us confused when we start thinking about it. You might want to call a bear an herbivore because you see it eating berries. But the bear could also go and eat fish that same day, and that would make it an omnivore. And then we have these two, I guess, kind of offshoot things. They consume food, but they consume some very odd things, and that was scavengers and decomposers. Scavengers eat the meat and bones of dead animals, and they do that. That's how they get their energy. They don't really hunt for food. They kind of find dead things and they eat them, and they have a very important role. They have a very important niche that they fulfill in the ecosystem. You can't have all of that dead stuff just lying around. So scavengers eat the meat and bones of dead things. But obviously, I don't think that, I mean, sometimes they may eat it all, but there's sometimes that dead things just happen and the scavenger doesn't get to them. Maybe a tree falls in the forest. Well, scavenger's not going to come and eat the tree. Maybe a deer dies and nothing finds it in the forest. That's very possible. We need something else to break down those dead things, and that's going to be our decomposers. So decomposers are these tiny microscopic things called bacteria, these little organisms that we can't see until we look under a microscope, called bacteria. We have fungi or mushrooms, and then we have earthworms, and they are all decomposers. They break down dead things, dead plants, dead animals, and they break them down into their minerals, and they create very rich, very good soil to use. It's important to have decomposers. You want them breaking down all of that dead stuff. Otherwise, it could harm the ecosystem. Now, again, we're looking at a whole. If we could break down just one part of an ecosystem and just look at the living things, the producers, the consumers, the decomposers, the things that are alive, that would be our community. That would be our community. Now, it's an important word. I mean, obviously, it's going to show up on the quiz. But community is one of those things I just need you to understand when you see it in text. We're not going to use it a lot, but I don't want you to get confused if you read that in a passage. That just means all the living things in an area, the community. And that's why we have that vocabulary word. However, this last one is very important, and that is carrying capacity. Carrying capacity means that an ecosystem can only hold so much of a species before that area starts to run out of resources like food, water, and shelter for the species to survive and thrive. If we were to go to Florida and we went out into the Everglades, and there's thousands upon thousands of snakes in the Everglades, and the Everglades can actually hold that much. It's not a problem for the Everglades to hold all those snakes. However, if we put millions and millions of snakes, all of a sudden you would start running out of water, food, shelter for these snakes, and these snakes would not have enough resources to survive. They would die. And if that happens, there's like a domino effect that happens in the ecosystem. If all the snakes die, then all of a sudden their food source starts to grow. So maybe there's a lot of rats and small fish, and their populations start to grow, and that could have an adverse effect on the ecosystem as well. You do not want to exceed the carrying capacity of an area. I know right now in California there's lots of wildfires that are burning through, and a lot of those animals in those areas are relocating to other places. There are going to be some places where the carrying capacity might be exceeded, but as soon as the food and the water and the shelter resources start to run low, those animals will continue to move until those numbers balance out, because the ecosystem does not like it when the carrying capacity is exceeded. So those are all of our vocabulary words for this week. That's what we've really kind of gotten into before we really start diving into ecosystems. We wanted to cover the basics. So now it's up to you. You've got some tests on Nearpod. I know some people need to take those quizzes. Some of you have already finished that. I've got about half the class that still needs to make their video on Flipgrid about biotic versus abiotic. And then today, I assigned a quiz in Quiziz. It's a practice quiz. It will let you know how well you understand all of these concepts. Do you need to come back and watch these videos more and spend more time on the Nearpod slides? Maybe you need to watch the videos that are attached in Nearpod a little bit more to get a better understanding of biotic versus abiotic or producers. Maybe you get the three consumers mixed up, the carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores, and it's time to study some more. The grade that you get in the quiz is probably what you're going to get on the quiz when we take that, and we'll do that next week. It's a practice quiz. I think you can take it as many times as you want to help you practice. And I think that that's a good thing. So make sure that you do that. So you have the Nearpod quizzes, you have the Flipgrid video, and today you have the quiz. If you've done all that, you've done all the work for me so far, and you're good. If you have not, you got some catching up to do. But I don't think that that's a lot, and even if you haven't done any of that yet, you could catch up today, no problem. There's the bell. Time for me to start getting ready for the other portions of class, and I hope to see a lot of people on Zoom today. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. Seeing that this is a YouTube channel, you know what we have to say. Smash that like button and make sure you click subscribe.